Twitter has labeled NPR as state-affiliated media, a designation traditionally that's been reserved for foreign media outlets that represent the official views of the government of those countries, like Russia's RT or China's Xinhua. But apparently this goes against Twitter's own current guidelines, which state that news outlets like NPR, it's actually in the guidelines as an example, are not state-affiliated media because they have editorial independence, despite getting some of their funding from the government. At least that was before Tuesday. Now it seems that reference to NPR has been deleted, according to Forbes.
In response to Variety, NPR CEO John Lansing blasted the move, saying, "We were disturbed to see last night that Twitter has labeled NPR as state-affiliated media, a description that, per Twitter's own guidelines, does not apply to NPR. NPR and our member stations are supported by millions of listeners who depend on us for the independent, fact-based journalism we provide. NPR stands for freedom of speech and holding the powerful accountable. It is unacceptable for Twitter to label us this way. A vigorous, vibrant free press is essential to the health of our democracy." This is wild to me, I gotta say. Not just because NPR was previously in the guidelines, et cetera, as an excluded example of what is not state-owned media, state-affiliated media. Here's what today the guidelines say. They say that state-affiliated media accounts are defined as outlets where the state exercises control over editorial content through financial resources, direct or indirect political pressures, and or control over production or distribution. Accounts belonging to those qualifying will be labeled as such. State-financed media organizations with editorial independence like the BBC in the UK, for example, are not defined as state-affiliated media for the purposes of this policy. Now, I don't want to be a jokester here, but the idea that there was a meaningful difference, that BBC, I don't mean to make references to The Crown to prove my point here. I know that it's a fictional show, but there is a relationship that is described between BBC on that show.
There is, absolutely.
With The Crown in terms of wanting to curry favor with the Queen, put on programming that she finds to be favorable, doing her golden coronation or whatever it is for her to be.
I agree with that completely. If your point is that the BBC is deserving of the state-affiliated label to a greater extent than NPR. I wholeheartedly agree.
Moreover, I know that people have their feelings about RT, but if the standard for not getting the label is editorial independence, I have to point to examples like Abby Martin, who was an anchor on the show back in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea, annexed Crimea. She very bravely, some people thought, but was ultimately allowed to take a real stand on RT against Russia's actions at that time. And even though she was much maligned as an RT reporter in the mainstream press, when she did that, every media outlet in the world, it seemed, wanted to have her on and celebrate her ability to do so on that show. And what she has said, I've interviewed her on my own podcast, she has said she got no pushback. She was not sanctioned at all by RT for doing so. So you can say they let some reporters have a long leash. She's an American on the American wing of the app, of the channel, whatever. But you can find instances where there has been absolutely coercion by the United States government on American reporters about their reporting, and those kind of networks don't get the label. Former co-host of this very show, Crystal Ball, has talked about not government-based coercion, but kind of the soft pressure she experienced at a mainstream network for simply being critical of Hillary Clinton in the lead-up to the 2016 election. So to take NPR, which has its faults, I will grant you, but is one of the more relatively independent and nonpartisan, again, I know that's a stretch, but relatively independent cultural resources in the United States of America. I have some problems with their funding, and I think that has impacted the quality of their content, and I can go on for that for about 20 minutes, but I won't. But to focus on NPR and not MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, BBC, any of these other stations is deeply hypocritical in my view.
I agree in part. Obviously, like the content at NPR is pretty, in fact, indistinguishable from to my mind, from the content at other liberal media. The state, I don't think the U.S. government is exercising control over the content at NPR. to any extent beyond the way they're actually exercising control everywhere, because we have learned there is, in fact, political pressure coming from various state agencies.
Yeah, should Twitter have a state agency badge on it?
Twitter itself moderated content at the behest of the U.S. government time and time and time again. So it's not. So the only thing that actually distinguishes NPR is that it does receive government funding in a direct way, unlike any of these other companies. The internal pressure at MSNBC to censor Crystal is not state.
But also the advertising. We talk about this all the time. Mm-hmm. Why is Lockheed Martin taking out advertisements on MSNBC? Is the argument that I'm going to be at home, eating my TV dinner and say, oh yeah, I was debating between which missile I was going to buy, and like that's the real one. Thanks for advertising this on my Morning Joe. Well, no. That there is a Noam Chomsky. Everybody has written about the influence that advertising spending has on programming, soft or hard. That's a reality.
We disagree on this. It has. I know that's the view. Maybe that's the way it was. Today, it's just not. The advertisers don't have nearly as much control as other factors. So the audience has the control, in fact.
I think it's a mixed bag. I think that we saw this with Trump, that as advertisers fled, if you just have one good advertiser who's willing to have your back, that matters. If you lose your audience, then sometimes that's more important than the advertisers, because you can find a supplementary advertiser as long as you hold on to the audience. All of those things can be true. At the same time, though, I think it's ridiculous to focus on this really kind of narrow, subjective standard of how much editorial independence exists when there is such a warped view of what constitutes editorial independence, given all of the kind of soft pressures that exist in the media.
And I want to move back to that in a minute, but just from the advertiser standpoint again, and it's not because I'm like carrying water or something for advertisers. In fact, I'm not in my career here at The Hill, my entire career reason, I have never once. I've had differences with management. I've had differences with readers and audiences. I've never had to make a decision differently because of an advertiser, ever. Once. It's never happened. And it has happened because of differences with management, differences with coworkers, differences with, again, the expectations of the audience. Like, oh, do our people like Trump? How does that how does that color what we cover? It's just never. Maybe I'm unique. Maybe I've just been very lucky to never run up against this pressure. I've never once had the pressure because of advertisers. Let me ask you this. I don't even know who the advertisers and funders are most of the time. Given
the overwhelming polling, the polls show an overwhelming distaste for increased military spending. I think it's 60% of Americans want the defense budget to shrink. Mm-hmm. Given the overwhelming popularity of programs like universal health care, where you have 70% of Americans who want those kind of programs, and given, in contrast, the significant spending of defense companies and pharmaceutical companies on TV, despite the fact that most people aren't going into their doctor's office saying, hey, I saw this drug on the television and that's why I want it to be prescribed. You're relying on the advice that's coming from your doctor's offices first. And in other countries, by the way, they don't allow those kind of direct-to-consumer advertisements the way that we have in the United States of America. Do you think that there's no relationship between what's happening on those programs and the nature of the advertisements and the choice for the programming itself not to reflect the overwhelming interests and desires of the American public?
I'm not saying, obviously they advertise for a reason, because they want to call attention to their products. I probably think it's not as important or useful as advertisers think it is, but I don't let them know that. I don't think it exercises as much editorial control as people. People really think it's the advertisers.
It's not a direct.
It's not been in my experience.
The whole point of manufacturing consent and those kinds of arguments is not that it's a hard or direct pressure. It's that it's a soft pressure, and that's partly why it's more dangerous. Why it's more pernicious. I feel
soft pressures. I just don't feel them from the advertisers. Well, but I want to go back to the NPR question real quick before we wrap on this. So again, yes, according to their own previous rules, maybe they're revising the rules. It doesn't make sense to call NPR state affiliated. I don't really care. I would just rather I would like them to not be state funded. Like, they should not be state funded in my view, at all. I would end that, and then they're not state affiliated at all, and they can
you don't want anything
like all
to
the rest
be
of
state
us.
Funded. Look, I do think
especially
that
not anything perspective based media company.
I do think that there is a meaningful, while NPR is liberal, I do think there's a meaningful difference between the kind of coverage you get on corporate liberal media, precisely because.
Is there?
Yeah, at least there used to be. I have seen a shift. I noticed in 2020 when I was at home a lot and listening to a lot more radio that there was a shift from being, I think, entirely listener funded and government funded to having taking on certain corporate donors, I think, from the banking industry and the oil industry. And I was shocked to hear those ads and then to hear what I perceive to be subjectively a softness in the coverage of some related issues that I found to be very disappointing, because NPR had a reputation, because it was listener funded and because it was government funded and because there was supposed to be some kind of Chinese walls between its funding and its content, it was able to push back against things like the military industrial complex in the way that you didn't get on mainstream channels from either party's perspective. I think that we are losing that, and maybe NPR getting kind of hamstrung in this way isn't that much of a loss as a consequence. But I do see the value in having an independently funded media, funded by tax dollars, that is independent from both the government. So the funding is absolutely guaranteed, or else it would be coercive. The government would be able to coerce programming, and also isn't so reliant on having to curry favor for ad dollars. I do think that is a national benefit to have.
I don't know. I think it's hard to structure such a thing where
you want to cancel PBS?
Yes. I'm not gonna. No, do Americans want their tax dollars spent on this kind of thing?
Yes, Americans love Sesame Street. It's been educating American children for like 50 years, teaching Americans how to read.
Never liked Sesame
for like 50
Street.
years. Oh. All right. Well, Robbie comes out against Big Street. What do we have next on Rising tomorrow?
Well, our team is already hard at work planning a very exciting Thursday show for you. Gonna hold Oscar the Grouch here accountable, I guess. So make sure you tune in.
I guess that makes me Big Bird today.
just because of the
yellow. Okay. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. For those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. All right. Bye-bye. See you later.